So wages are pretty stagnant, relatively speaking. House prices through the roof, student loans through the roof, tuition through the roof because of the student loans, exactly the same system. The student comes, says, hey, I want to go to college. Bank says, sure, 200K in your account deposit, and you owe us 200K.
Plus interest.
Plus interest, which isn't created, which you have to work for to pay. The bank just says, press the button. And all this is based on the Federal Reserve System. And this also leads to inflation.
Welcome to Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Philipp. Today we have with us Valentin Schmid. He's the business editor at Epoch Times and one of my colleagues. It's a real pleasure having you on.
Hey, Josh, finally we get a chance to talk about the Fed.
Yeah, and as he said, today we're going to be talking about the Federal Reserve, how the boom-bust cycles work, how debt slavery works, how the printing of money is stealing your savings. When we talk about the Fed, how would you describe the Fed? It's not, you go ahead and describe. How would you describe it?
So first of all, it's so funny that when I started working here, I kept telling people about the Fed, and everybody was like, what is this? What does this have to do with me? Even like the smart people like Josh. Oh. But once I started to explain it to them, they realized that basically it's a corrupt, unjust system. And I think what most people feel, even if they don't understand 100%, they really think it's not working for them. There's like this invisible barrier. They never can make ends meet. They have to pay interest here. Their wages don't go up, but the house prices go up. So the people know there's something wrong. And we can talk about why it is a corrupt system, why it's an unjust system. Josh told me we only have 45 minutes, which I know in video land is long, yeah. But you can talk about this for 10 hours.
Yeah, so on that note, yeah, if you wanted to do a deep dive, it'd probably take a good 10 hours or so.
Yeah.
So we're going to give kind of a more high-level view of how this stuff works. And if you pull out a dollar bill or any currency, American currency in your pocket, you'll see it says Federal Reserve Note at the top. And the Federal Reserve is neither federal nor is it a reserve.
So that's how it starts. That's how all the misnomers and deceptions start. And I think we did a special a while ago. Maybe we can link to that. We have got a few more videos.
We did one where we talked about the boom-bust cycles, which is how the economic cycles of booms and busts work. When the Federal Reserve wants to, create inflation, they can create a boom, and when they want to tighten it in, they can create a bust, and how that whole thing works. And another one on the war economies, going back hundreds of years, and how the whole system works. So we'll touch on that. If you want to go real deep, you can read the articles. But
that's right. We'll explain it on a high level. So what you just said, Josh, basically you have a dollar. It says Federal Reserve Note. It's all basically, and then they basically, I think it also says promise to pay the bearer $1. So that already tells you something. You have a dollar, and then they promise you to pay you another $1. So what's the point? And that's exactly how this system basically is set up. It's some people would call it fraudulent system, where the Fed and the banks, they claim to have something that they really don't, and that's called fractional reserve banking, which is essentially, it doesn't have to be the Fed, it can be any other central bank. It has been practiced even before central banking, but the way it works and why it is problematic is because the banks or the Fed, they take money or they print money, and then they have reserves, and that could be dollars, could be gold, could be anything, but the point is they have a bunch of reserves. It's real money, real savings, but then on top of that, they can basically print money. Whether it's the Fed or the banks doesn't matter, but let's explain it with the banks, because that's actually more money than the Fed is managing, and that was responsible for the last housing bust. So the Fed kept rates really low, kept regulations low, and then the banks were like, hey, that's great. Let's say Josh wants to buy a house. Normally people think somebody has to save up. I have to save up the money, $200,000 or $300,000, whatever, put it in the bank, and then the bank gives that money to Josh so he can build a house. That's what they're trying to tell you in school, but that's not how it works. The way it works is Josh goes to the bank, says, I want to buy a house. Then they say, okay, what's your credit? Okay, it's pretty good. Press a button, and then the 300,000 show up in his account as a deposit with the bank, and then he can go and take that to buy a house. And then on the other side of the balance sheet, the TBar balance sheet of the assets of the bank, so the things that the bank owns, is a loan to Josh, created at the same time in a second. Boom. deposit and loan. And you can go buy a house, but what happened? It's just that they press something in the computer and then there's $300,000 that have real consequences in the economy. When you go buy a house, then maybe the house prices go up a little bit. And then you extrapolate this 100 million times, and that's why you have house prices rising in the early 2000s, leads to the housing bubble, and we can talk about the bust later. But that's also happening now. Why are house prices so expensive? Why is tuition so expensive? Why is everything where you can borrow money to get it so expensive, and everything that you cannot borrow money is sort of okay, but especially wages? You can't borrow against wages. You can't print money. You can't go to the bank and say, hey, I'm going to work for 10 years. Give me a loan for that. I mean, there are some stuff you can twiggle around, but it's not exactly as straightforward. So wages are pretty stagnant, relatively speaking. House prices through the roof, student loans through the roof, tuition through the roof because of the student loans, exactly the same system. The student comes, says, hey, I want to go to college. Bank says, sure, 200K in your account deposit, and you owe us 200K. Plus interest, which isn't created, which you have to work for to pay. The bank just has to press the button. All this is based on the Federal Reserve System. And this also leads to inflation. Consumer prices normally less so, but also because all that money then really trickles down from the houses and the stocks and the colleges to buy more stuff. And that's why the dollar has lost 90% of its value since the inception of the Federal Reserve System.
And so to break this down a bit, the bank says it has a certain amount of money, say backed by gold, right? There's, say, $100 worth of gold. Of course, we're using dollars, which is their system anyways. And then 100 notes saying that these are equal to that amount of gold.
Right.
They then continue printing. And so while the initial printing had 100 with 100, the next printing means 200 with 100. And so in other words, that banknote you have is worth half of what it used to be in terms of the hard assets, even though the one you have in your pocket still says the same number.
So that's why it's fraudulent, because it represents something that it's not there. And this is illustrated by the fact that your deposits in the bank are called demand deposits, because you can demand them at any time. And normally, I mean, now they put more and more restrictions on it, people lose less cash anyway, but it serves to prove a point, because if I go to the bank, if everybody went to the bank and said, I want my deposits in cash, they couldn't pay you because they neither have that green money, the cash, nor do they have the actual electronic reserves available to pay out all the deposits. And this is how the money keeps expanding and expanding and expanding. Prices go up.
Because of the printing, which leads to inflation, which means the bill's technically worth less, even though wages don't go up, even though the amount in your pocket doesn't go up. What's it, every 10 years it doubles? Is this still accurate?
I think the doubling, I think you have to have around 7% to double in 5 years. Well, I mean, we can do the math later, but it is basically, you lose about 2-3% so per year, so maybe you lose about half or so in 5 years or 6 years, yeah.
And so think about that. That means if you've been working your whole life and you've saved $20,000 in 10, 15 years, that $20,000 in terms of actual assets is going to be worth $10,000.
Or less. In 20 years, it's definitely going to be less. Yeah.
And then in another 10 years, that's going to be worth $5,000.
Yeah.
So you another 10, 2,500.
Yeah.
And so in other words, you've worked your whole life. You put this money in the bank. You think it's safe. You think it's your savings. But because of inflation, because of the way that the actual value changes as opposed to what's written on the number on the bill, you lose your life savings essentially.
So that's it. That's basically another tax, because the government, they benefit from this process. Why? Because their tax base goes up. It's based in nominal dollars. So any nominal dollar that may be worth less, but they still tax it at 20-30% or whatever they do. So their tax revenue goes up, plus government issues a lot of debt, which, by the way, is the same process that I just explained to you with the houses, also works with the federal government, which is why the federal government likes the Fed.
We should probably step back a little bit, too, because maybe you could explain this to us. From what I understand, when you take out a loan, the bank essentially creates that money
Yeah.
out of nowhere.
That's just
and
that's
they're,
what
they're
I
given that
explained.
power.
Yeah.
They're given that ability.
By the Federal
They-
Reserve
they-
System.
Yeah, they write down, you know, $300,000. That is $300,000 that did not currently exist, did not previously exist in the economy. Is this accurate?
That's right. Yeah. That's
And
what.
so-
Yeah.
They create wealth. They create money out of thin air, which you have to pay.
Yeah, you have to be, so that's the process. So Josh goes to the bank, they just create the money, here's your deposit, here's our loan, just like this on the balance sheet. But you have to then go to work and over 20, 30 years actually do something to pay off your mortgage. So that's not fair.
And for them, they don't care if you pay it back, from what I understand. Because essentially they've created that wealth. If you fail to pay it, you can take out a second mortgage.
Yeah.
They get you deeper in debt. They create more wealth because they write on their books more, right? Is this how
Yeah,
it
I
works?
mean, yes, to a certain degree, they would have you roll it and then refinance it. As long as it stays on the balance sheet at face value, they basically don't care. All of this is enabled by the Federal Reserve System, and we can talk about this in more detail later. The Federal Reserve created and protects the system. So when do banks actually care about when they get paid back or not? That's in 2007, 2008. They do care because if the people default and say we're not going to pay you back, and the accounting rules are such that then you have to mark down the assets, that's another problem because your loans are, from the bank's perspective, your loans are now worth nothing, but your deposits, you're still on the hook for the deposits. They didn't go down. So again, the bank cannot pay. They made all these promises, but because of the wrong incentive system, now they can't pay. And that's when they go to the federal government to get a bailout, which is another thing the Federal Reserve has intensified over the years. They make sure that the banks get bailed out. The first time that happened during the Great Depression, that happened very late. And since then, basically, anytime you have something, the banks get bailed out by the federal government.
And that was also why the Federal Reserve was started. It was because these big bankers got together. Long story short, you hear about, you know, the creature from Jekyll Island, which is a great book, by the way. Jekyll Island was the place where these big bankers held this secret meeting to plan out the creation of the Federal Reserve. America's founders, a lot of them, Jefferson, for example, were very, very opposed to the idea of the English-style system of banking coming to the United States. You hear about the Rothschilds and stuff like that. These were big,
and by the way,
bankers.
that's exactly it. In England, they had a privately owned central bank which had the license to issue money. And that's what they wanted to recreate. They had the first bank, the second bank, and you always had, you know, President Jackson, for example, was fighting back against it. But then, yes, with the Federal Reserve, those forces, the banking forces, who wanted to have a cartel, succeeded in creating a privately owned central bank. We can talk about the ownership.
There's a lot of conspiracy theories because the government officials who were stopping it, who were opposed to it, ended up getting killed in the Titanic. You know, it's a long story. You can believe what you want to believe, whether it was manufactured or not. But
well, some people who have opposed the banking system, I think it was President Garfield or, you know, even Jackson, they tried to assess
right.
some of them. I mean, there is some pattern there. For that, you have to ask other people, but there is some pattern there. Anyway, they succeeded, the bankers, and this is not conspiracy, this is historical fact, that they all went down there, they hashed it out, they made the plan, and then it came into effect.
Was it J.P. Morgan?
Mostly J.P. Morgan, a couple politicians, Senator Aldrich.
Then the Rothschilds sent their representative, Warburg.
Warburg was there, yes. So this is all historical fact, and the end product is what we have, and it clearly benefits the banks. So
how did this work before the Fed was created, and how did this tie into the creation of the Fed in terms of what these guys wanted?
So why did the bankers want this centrally controlled? And I mean, it is privately owned, but it's part government controlled. So essentially, they are giving up controls. Why would they want that? And the way it happened before is that there were fewer ways to get bailed out. Now, when does a bank need to get bailed out? And that's very important. There's two different aspects. We talked about it before. One is when the loans become worth less and less and less, and the equity capital or the money that the bank owners put in is not enough to compensate for that. Then the bank goes bankrupt, the investors would lose their money, which is exactly what should happen in a free market, because if you make dumb loans, bad loans, you should be punished for it.
So in other words, banks had an incentive to not give overly risky loans because they might go bankrupt.
That's right.
Yeah.
The actual partners or investors or shareholders, they had an incentive to use better judgment. And now let's contrast that with the current system, especially the last crisis around. So not only don't you have to come up with the money, you can print the money, give it to people who are not creditworthy, and then you're almost sure you get bailed out. And obviously, you know, the shares of the Citigroup went down or whatever, but the management didn't care so much about it. And then the question is, who are the shareholders of Citigroup? And most of the time it's pension funds and whatever. So the shareholders are actually not that important. It's more the bondholders of the banks who loan money to the banks and the management of the banks who gets the bonus paid out, mostly in cash, some of it stock, but a lot of cash during the expansion phase. And then what's the second thing that can make a bank, or could make a bank, go bankrupt, which the bankers wanted to avoid? It's if it overissued notes. Because once we stopped dealing in gold, the bank said, okay, Josh, you have a piece of gold or you want to store it at our bank, that's fine. We'll give you a note for it. You get a gold coin in our bank, and then you can take that note, which is easier to carry, and give it to somebody else, and they would say, oh yeah, you get some gold in that bank, and that's
and
cool.
A lot of people were opposed to it. I think that was it around the Civil War that happened?
That happened, you know, even before that. You had those receipts for your gold. That was cool. No, that's not the problem. That's fine, because who wants to carry around a lot of gold? Paper is more efficient. The problem starts when the bank, who is the only entity which can see what is in the vault, says, okay, we got 100 gold coins from different people, but we're giving out 1,000 notes. And nobody knows, because nobody can see in our vault. But the market or people or speculators, they find out about it one way or another, and then they come back to the bank and they start, hey, I want my gold back. I want my gold back. And then what happens? You give 100 people the gold, and then what does the 101st person do? He now has a claim on the bank that the bank can't satisfy, so the bank is bankrupt. So again, that's one thing that the bankers didn't want. They didn't want the redeemability. That's why they wanted to go on a full paper system organized by a centrally planned authority, which could then print up money, which, by the way, the Fed has been doing all the time. Even recently, the Fed started printing up money. The banks ran out of it they had some regulatory liquidity shortages. Fed starts to print money and gives it to the banks. Can't do that with gold.
And keep in mind, when they do that, it's like they're stealing your savings, basically.
Yeah, eventually this process is inflationary, and also they're stealing your savings through inflation. That's the long-term effect, but philosophically speaking, you have to think about it. These dollars that the banks don't have anymore, that they used to have, and then they disappeared or they get marked down, they used to have value, and somebody bought something for that with value down the chain. And now the bank lost it, but the Fed is printing another one to replace it for doing nothing. So you're basically getting value twice for doing nothing. And this is fundamentally economically unsound and also unjust, because the fundamental economic principles, natural laws are you're supposed to earn what you get. You're supposed to work for it, or have a smart idea, or you actually have to risk your own money to invest it, and then you get compensated for that. That's all okay, because you're doing something, you're giving something up. But with this system, where the banks can loan out money, then get the cash bonuses, charge interest, then get bailed out, it's basically something for nothing.
And so this gets into, I think, where we talk about boom-bust cycles. How would you explain the boom-bust cycles?
So we already touched on this, and now we're tying it all together. So you don't have the gold, or even the dollars. If the dollars were 100% backed, it would also be okay. They're not. So you have the system, which is expanding through loans, like subprime, for example. And 1 year you have $1 trillion in house loans, the next year you have 2, then you have 3, and you have these interest charges on it. And that's the problem, because the bank, they can print up the money for the loan, but they cannot print up the money for the interest, because there's no...
And this is important too, because when we talk about how this is making housing prices go up, it's because of this bank system. They can charge money for houses that you could never normally afford. Whereas without that system, they'd have to make the houses affordable if they're going to sell them.
Right, that's it.
Basically.
Yeah, you got it. So maybe we can talk about that, because this is interesting for people who want to understand why the house prices go up, why do student loans go up. It's because this system puts the how do you call it, the cart in front of the horse, because you are creating money for something that doesn't exist. So you have more money but no goods supply. Obviously, price has to go up. Whereas the normal system is the other way around. You'd have to save money for real productive work, investment, you name it. You get some savings, and then through those savings that you saved from your productive activity, so you already had some production, there's something there, then you take them and then you buy something that's already there.
And then based on the normal capitalism, this is...
Yeah, that's the real capitalism. Yeah, Federal Reserve is crony capitalism.
But when we talk about real capitalism, you're going to sell something based on what people are going to buy. If people don't buy it, you're going to fail. You're going to go out of business.
Yeah, you're not going to get bailed out.
And so this debt system, this debt slavery system, where you're working to pay back the bank, essentially, is something that goes against that.
Yeah,
it's an artificial system put in place that makes it so you can't afford it.
Yeah, it's basically how the government picks winners and losers. So you have a couple, you have 10 houses, and then you get a loan for another house. So now, and that money doesn't exist, so now the price for the 10 house goes up. Then the next guy who wants to buy another house, he is even less affordable, so his loan is going to be even bigger. But again, the banks, they want to expand it because they can charge you the interest. They know they're going to get bailed out. So this system goes up and up and up and up, and more debt and more debt and more debt.
And since we're talking about capitalism too, it's important to note that this is also something. Socialism doesn't abolish this. In fact, the socialists called for centralized banking.
Yeah, sure. It's in the Communist Manifesto. They started it. And if you think about it, I mean, what is socialism? There's so many definitions of socialism. To me, it's always when the cost and the benefit is out of sync. So you have somebody who has to bear the cost and somebody who has to bear the benefit. And clearly the system, the cost is borne by the brunt of the people who have to buy stuff and have to work and who cannot protect themselves against inflation by buying stocks or real estate or whatever. And the benefit is mostly the bankers, but also other people who basically have the know-how to invest in the right places and benefit from the system. So the cost and the benefit are out of sync. So to me, it's clearly socialist, even though it's not the classic socialism where the worker gets more money from the government or whatever, but one party benefits, the other party loses.
And of course, mentioned in the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah, it is mentioned there.
From the get-go, they did not intend to do away with this type of system.
Yeah, they wanted to get rid of gold. They wanted to have centralized bank and credit, which is exactly it. Now, to come back to the boom and bust, we went on a few tangents. Yeah. So you're printing up all the money for the loans, all this debt, and but you can't print up the interest. But the interest still has to be paid, because otherwise we go into the reverse, where we explained, and then the assets get marked down, and then you have to come up with more capital, so the shareholders are on the hook. So, so how can you pay the interest? The interest is being paid back by new loans being created because of the time difference, because the interest is only due later, and not everybody has to pay at the same time. So if you put in more money in the system, then some people will be able to make the interest payments. But obviously, at one point, something's got to give, because the fundamental mathematical equation of a certain amount of principal and money in existence and interest due that's not in existence, that has to be paid from the other money stock, that you cannot defeat. And then at most times, and this is going back to what you said with the Fed, how they print money, then it expands, and then they tighten it, and then it collapses. Throughout the history of the Federal Reserve, you have these cycles where they print money, and then you have the booms like the Roaring '20s, and then they hike the interest rates, so they make that money more expensive. They make it more difficult to pay that interest that doesn't exist in the first place, and then the people start defaulting. And when they start defaulting, then you take away even more of that debt stock, because
then the bank seizes the homes. The bank then controls the homes.
Yeah, they control the home. This is also unfair, because they did nothing to give you that money, and they still practically own it. But it doesn't really benefit them, because then they have to sell it. But there is no buyer, because everybody else is saying, so then the price goes down further. They have to mark it down, and that's when they go bust. And in the Great Depression, they all went really bust. And in 2008, they all got bailed out. And the Fed practically controls the cycle, this easing cycle, and then the tightening cycle. And then, again, this is maybe called conspiracy, but it is a fact that some people who are connected to the central banks, like Benjamin Baruch is a big name during the Great Depression period, they always seem to be able to know when the turning point is, where everybody else doesn't. And that may be coincidence or it may not be coincidence. So there's always somebody who's benefiting.
And I know a lot of financial guys who know this system. They kind of see history a lot differently than most people, including a lot of the wars. You and I, of course, wrote this article about the war loans and how these centralized banks will provide money to both sides of the war. And even through restricting or giving loans can even, in some ways, influence who wins.
Oh yeah, certainly. If you look at history, and most of this is documented fact, you have banks usually not taking sides. They loan to everybody, and then no matter what happens, they get to collect either from the winner or from the losers, or from both. And they benefit from it. Why do they benefit? Because the wars, and this is, by the way, true in this country, also in the recent history. If you look at how much debt the Iraq war tacked on the federal government's balance sheet, there was a couple of trillion, I think. So who is financing that? And again, obviously you cannot point to one bank and say they gave all the money to the government. No, of course it's the whole banking system.
And a lot of these banks are international.
International, well. Also, sure, but it doesn't really matter. It's basically the same process. The federal government goes to JP Morgan and says, hey, I need $1 billion. Now we're not talking about a couple 100,000. Now we're talking about billion. JP Morgan says, sure, give me your bond, sell me your bond, your note, whatever, 5-year, 10-year, and then I'll credit your deposit account with $1 billion. And it's exactly the same system with the house. That money didn't exist, but now there's a bond and there's a deposit account, and then the federal government can spend it on buying some bombers from Lockheed Martin or whatever. So those people are happy about it. But if you look at the cost to the economy and the extra debt and everything, alone the Iraq war, I mean, you can go back to any type of war, World War II, World War I, any type of war.
Even the Napoleonic
Wars, the debts exploded beyond anything that was ever seen before, and the banks always managed to collect.
Interesting. And now, when we talk about the purpose of the Fed, written, at least on paper, it claims, or at least people who defend it claim, that it's meant to prevent these types of cycles. Right?
Well, I don't think they have a specific mandate. Their mandate is to maximize employment with low inflation. However, the proponents of the system have said that this centrally planned system is better than the market system, and it will alleviate the boom and bust cycles, which did exist before the Fed. However, why did they exist? Because of this fractional reserve banking, where banks overissued notes, or they issued too many loans and then got bailed out. That existed before also, in different times, different settings, and different severity, but that was the case, and that always creates the boom and bust cycle, and then you had those busts before.
And of course, the Fed has not only not prevented it from happening, but it's
gotten worse.
It's been a factor in these cycles.
Yeah. So at least the benefit of the bust before was that the people who made the dumb decisions, they got punished because the banks did go bust, and of course there were knock-on effects and unemployment, and yes, there's going to be negative effects for more people, which is why the system is bad. The fractional reserve system is a bad system. But the bankers get punished in that system, and that's why they created the Fed, because they wanted to get bailed out. And not only did the booms and busts get way bigger, but the bankers also got bailed out. I mean, the first boom, which is sort of, so the seeds were sown during the First World War, where you have the war finance from JP Morgan mostly, who financed the British and also the US government. And then you had a small correction beginning of the 20s, and then the Fed eased again massively, and then you had the roaring 20s. So that was a boom cycle. And then you had the huge bust cycle because the Fed tightened, and it didn't reform the system, and it didn't bail it out. So the choice is always, when you have the bust, it's like, what are you going to do like last time? Do you scrap the system and start again? I would like to try that for once. There's a lot of 100 million different ideas out there, but let's look into a couple of them. Or do you bail everybody out? Now, in the 30s, they did neither. Neither did they reform the system, nor did they do the bailout, which was the worst. But it was the Federal Reserve who was responsible. So epic fail. That was the worst economic disaster in American history. Federal Reserve in charge. Epic fail, way worse than what we had before. And then last time, 2008, that was, in terms of numbers, the biggest fail ever, thanks to the Federal Reserve System. And this time they bailed them out, and we're still looking in the future how that is going to play out. Eventually, there may have to be a bigger bust than we saw in 2008, but I think some people are overestimating the chances of that happening tomorrow, in the next 5 years or 10 years. Because one thing I will say about the central planners at the Fed, and they are central planners, they have gotten much better recently to stay on top of things and wiggle and twiggle and extend and pretend. I think they're pretty good at that right now.
And that brings us, I think, to the current stage. We hear about this coming financial crisis. There's different pictures being shown to the world. You hear about this coming financial crisis, then at the same time you see rising economy. At the same time, you saw that during the Obama years, the Fed had 0% interest. Under Trump, I think it was 3 or more percent.
They jacked it up to 2.5, yeah.
2.5. And so in terms of money, could you explain this to us? What's happening?
Okay.
Why they changed the numbers, what that means in terms of actual money.
So now we're looking at a different focus, because this thing is so complex and so bizarre, and we touched on a lot of things today, and I encourage your viewers and your readers to go back to that our series, and you will find more in-depth material to every single point. From a political point of view, it's very clear that the Fed is a totally establishment organization, even though a lot of the chairs have been Republicans, but they are in favor of keeping the status quo. And the status quo has been, for both parties really, to keep the financial system afloat. You know, the bailout was carried by both parties. So that's why they liked Obama. He was a status quo guy. He just kept the things flowing. He bailed them out. He didn't punish them. The executives got to stay, all this. So they like the guy. And they keep him, obviously it helps if you keep the rates at zero.
And what does it mean? In terms of practical numbers, what does it mean if the rates are at zero? Just for our viewers.
So that basically, very simple, there's like a very complex transmission mechanism, but the money printing that we explained to you has to do with the interest rate and the Fed balance sheet. And the lower the rate and the more money the Fed creates on its balance sheet, which is separate from the other banks, but it's sort of like the foundation of the pyramid for the other banks, the more money of this type of money is sloshing around the system and can do things and can bid up houses and employ people. Even though it's inefficient, it does something, Even in Venezuela, they have got something going on if there's not more money in the system, even though it's becoming less and less and less because of the other adverse factors. And you have those other adverse factors here too, like too much regulation, too high tax, all this kind of stuff, which President Trump has done already, delivered on the tax cuts and the deregulations. So, and to the Fed, I believe President Trump is not a status quo guy, even though he has very mixed messages when it comes to the Fed and sound money. I don't think Trump is a sound money guy either. But he's not a status quo guy, so I don't think they trust him. And that's why it was easy for them to say, let's jack up the rates to 2.5%. But maybe also, we don't know. There's no hard evidence for it, because as far as I can judge from the Fed people, that's probably what their models told them. Now we can, hike the rates a little bit. The models say we should do this, so we just do it.
And so I've heard people say that when they hike the rates, if the economy does better and they hike the rates, it's like we don't feel the benefits of a rising economy. Is that accurate?
In general, that interest rate hike. So again, and the reduction of the balance sheet, less money around, less easy to do good things. But if you have the tax cuts and the deregulation on the other side, that sort of makes up for it. What component influences what exactly, nobody knows. But yes, in general, if you are within that system, you hike the rates, you reduce the money around, it's going to have a headwind effect.
And now we saw also, there's been kind of, if you read in a lot of the media, they're like, there's a tradition where sitting presidents don't criticize the Federal Reserve. And of course, they're critical of Trump because he has criticized the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, it makes total sense. It's all part of the same system. Like the Fed wins, the government wins, the president appoints the Fed chair. the banks donate to the president's party. Yeah, of course. So don't criticize. It's a great system. Works for everybody. What's there to criticize?
Works for everyone in power.
Exactly. Yeah. So what's there to criticize? Now, again, Trump, not the normal type of politician. They don't trust him, and he knows that with the other points he's pushing, he basically can't afford. I mean, he doesn't pull any punches to really anything. So it makes total sense from his perspective to criticize the Fed for raising the rates, because it could indeed have. And we got some sort of, little preview of that last year, 2018, when the stock market crashed 20% in 2 months because the Fed had raised the rates, and that's when they stopped and flip-flopped. And now the stock market's up again. President Trump did a good thing because he said, this is on you. If the market crashes, it's your fault. And in that way, he is correct, because higher rates, less money, speculators, withdraw from the market, people get scared about the economy. So that's true. And if the market had crashed further, he could have had a scapegoat. So from his political strategy, it makes total sense, A, because he's a renegade anyway, and B, he would have had somebody to basically justifiably blame the whole thing on and say, hey, look, you kept it at 0 for Obama, you're raising it here. What are you going now? The stock market is down not 20% but 50%. This is clearly on you and not on me.
And I know that he's kind of backed off of this criticism a little bit because they are bringing it back now.
Yeah, so now the antagonism, I don't really understand, that the whole Powell-Trump relationship. Why do you appoint the guy if you then only wanted to criticize him all the time? But then again, now the guy totally flip-flopped. The real money printing, the QEs, the quantitative easing after the crisis that people got so, freaked out about, because the money printing always happened. It wasn't trillions. It was always like a billion and tens of billions. Now you print a trillion, 2 trillion. And that's what freaked people out, especially the hard money crowd, after the crisis. Now they're printing hundreds of billions. There is no crisis. This hasn't happened before. Whereas the last thing you could at least, again, from a systemic perspective, you're judging within the system. You're not judging the system. You're inside of it. You're saying, okay, you got to do this because there's a crisis and you have to make up for it. And now there is no crisis and they're printing hundreds of billions. So
would you say it's because they're claiming that this financial crisis is on the horizon? Would that be related in any way?
If I was the Fed chair and all my indicators tell me there is going to be a crisis, then yes, I would start printing money before the Bear Stearns goes bankrupt and before the Lehman Brothers goes bankrupt. However, I don't think there's, I sort of picked them up a little bit. I said they're good at juggling things, and but they're not that good at recognizing economic downturns. The Fed has never, ever, even though they're responsible, they never came out before 2008 and said, hey, there's going to be a recession. Or before 2000, they said, hey, there's going to be, they have no idea. So to be honest, this is, again, a completely novel thing where you have no real issues, like at least the headline economic numbers are good. There's no real financial issues except for this, liquidity shortage, which they happened before in the last 10 years. It's not like the first time that happened. They bailed that out, and then they're starting to print money now. It could be that Powell is extra smart and he sees some trouble on the horizon, so he prints some more money. But I think the more plausible reason is that it's not the economy itself. It may not even be the loans, because last time it was the housing loans that brought the ship down. It may really be just liquidity in the banking system that is lacking because of new regulation or whatever, and he just wants to make up for it because he wants to help the banks. But in this case, helping the banks also helps Trump because the stock market is an all-time high, and it's more likely the economy will stay stable or expanding for next year for the election.
I see, and I guess just last question. If you were to tell anyone about the Federal Reserve, based on, I guess, what we talked about, what would you want them to kind of take away from this whole segment?
So the Federal Reserve System is basically a representative of the financial system that we have in this country, which, in my opinion, is a corrupt, unjust system that steals from the less well-off and gives everything to the rich and powerful, which is, basically is a bad system and it should be reformed. And the unfortunate part of this is that the people behind it, the bankers and the politicians and everybody, they designed it in such a way that you have to basically explain things for 10 hours for somebody to really, really understand why is it bad and what is the problem. And the effects are so gradual and so long term, and some of the stuff is so complicated from an economic perspective that it's really hard to understand. So I would encourage your reader to take that. It's a corrupt system. You were right about the things you think are wrong, but you don't know why, you can't pinpoint it.
And then people think it's like capitalism, or they think
no, it has nothing to do with capitalism. Again, we talked about this is my definition of socialism, but the costs do not represent the benefits, and also there's no win-win. Market capitalism is always a win-win because you're buying something, you're giving up something voluntarily because you want to have something. Yeah, of course.
Of course, the state owning of the financial system.
Yeah, and
so
it's a hybrid system, yeah. Really. It's a private but state-sponsored. Also, by the way, you may say all the Fed chairs are academics, Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke. Look who sponsors all the academic programs. And you will find a Citibank and JP Morgan there with large donations at the big universities. So it's not a coincidence.
But anyways, Val, I'd like to get you on again sometime soon.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, pleasure as always.
Take care.
Great. And everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.